of you are online, good to have you with us. A couple of 3 weeks ago, both Pastor Corey and Reverend Terry shared the same scripture. And it was about the woman caught in adultery, brought to Jesus without the man, but brought the woman. And then they asked him to make a pronouncement about her. Now, what they may not have known is that there's a variant reading of that story. And here's how it goes. It starts the same way. They bring the adulterous woman to Jesus, and they ask him to make a pronouncement. He bends down, and he writes in the dirt. Then he stands up, and he says, "Let he among you who is without sin cast the first stone." The people start to float away. Except there's this older woman that comes up from behind the crowd, and she walks all the way down to the woman and drops a pebble on her head. And Jesus looks at her and said, "Oh, Mom." For some reason, that did not make it into the Bible. We're in a sermon series right now on relationships. And the reason it's called Vital Signs is because if you try to take kind of the temperature of how a relationship is going, on a scale of 1 to 10, you'll find out there's a lot of them that fall in sort of that 4 to 5 out of 10 category. And it's not that it's awful, but it's also not necessarily great. And so this whole sermon series has been designed to try to help bolster relationships through some skills and techniques and understandings that maybe people didn't know. So that's the whole idea. Have you noticed relationships are a little tricky? Anybody here? Yeah, okay, half of you are in trouble, okay. Now relationships are tricky because when you have people who come together, there is automatic basis for friction that has to be resolved as time goes on because people are different, right? How many of you have met a couple who have bragged to you that in all the years that they have been together, they've never had a disagreement or a fight? You met people like that? How many of you thought to yourself, there's something wrong with you? Right? We can't be friends. That was delayed. Sometimes it's a difference in background. Sometimes it's a difference in ethnicity. Sometimes it's different value systems that come to play. Sometimes it's a personality difference. Every once in a while, Michelle will say, "I need to talk to you about something. I've been bothered by something." And so she'll start telling me, I'm a fixer. And so she'll talk for a while, and I'll kind of listen. And I'll come up, and pretty soon I'll say, "Well, here's 4 or 5 things you can do, Michelle, to take care of your problem." And it always works. No, not at all. That personality thing just, it can really throw a curveball. Now, there's another reason why relationships sometimes just stay at that 4 or 5 category. It has to do with mindset. And the mindset that creates the kind of communication that we do. Now, let me illustrate what I'm talking about. There's different ways of thinking. And one of them I describe with a period. And the sound that goes with that is duh. And those are people who have a mindset that I know what I know, I don't know what I don't know, and what I know seems to be enough, so don't bother me. Now, there's kind of a continuum, because there's some people down here that they have that kind of flexible thing. They're always curious. They're always wondering. They love to engage in discussions and learn stuff and try new things and stuff like that. Those people are easy to talk to. When you're in the middle and you're at the period, those people have a set mindset that they really don't want to be bothered with facts. And if you go further down this continuum to people who are driven by ideology, their mindset is even more static. In fact, not only are they fixed, they want to convert you to their mindset. Now, how do you break through that? I mean, all you got to do is look on social media, look on the news, and you can see that that kind of divide is everywhere. Now, it's probably about as bad as I've ever seen it in my life. So how do you break through that? I think there's one way to break through that has any chance, and that is to ask a question. And that is about the only way that people will move and say, I think I'm going to think differently about that, or I'm going to do a different thing. Now, some of you are going to say most people only change when there's pain. But it isn't because of the pain. It's because of the question that's created by the pain. And people start saying to themselves, I don't know if I want to keep doing this. Should I keep going this way? Should I stay on this path that I am? In 5 years, am I going to want to be where I am right now? Pain causes questions. And that's when people start to change. In fact, that's about the only time that anybody goes through any kind of transformation, is when they've hit a question that they can't answer. And then they go in search of what the answer is. Now, I want to show you why that works. You want to experiment with something? I want you to think for a second, what color is your car if you have one? Oh, count it. You're starting to answer. 1, 2, 3. Everybody shout out the color. Okay. Okay, I don't even know what to do with some of that. When you thought about the color of your car, your brain wouldn't do anything else. That's the only thing it was allowed to do. Because your brain, when it answers a question or hears a question, focuses in a different way than just conversation. In conversation, you can be sitting there and half listening to somebody talk, and what are you doing? You're preparing your rebuttal. So you've got two things going on, but when you hear a question, you can't do that. Your brain refuses to focus on anything else. And if you see a brain scan of somebody who's just been asked a question and compare that to somebody who's just in a discussion with somebody, the one who's responding to a question is all lit up. The neurons are firing. It's an entirely different brain because it wants to think about what the question was. Here's an interesting thing. If you simply ask a question to someone, it can increase the percentage chance of whether they will vote, whether they will increase their exercise, whether they'll buy a car, or give blood. And instead of saying, don't forget to vote, you say, have you voted today? 25% chance more that they will vote, simply because you asked them the question. Same thing, giving blood, all those things, it just increases it. That's why getting into a conversation with somebody and asking a question, especially if you're in a disagreement, changes the conversation and keeps it going. Now, not all questions are good. For instance, why are you so stupid? Does not fly. Are you crazy? Were you born under a rock? None of those should be on the board, okay? But I want you to hear how Jesus understood to interact with people, okay? Because he was a master of, I wanted you to know this, it's estimated that Jesus asked, give or take, 307 questions that we know of. Think about that. Now, some of it may be duplicated between some of the Gospels. That's irrelevant. Think how many questions that is. And Jesus used that approach towards dealing with people. And now, here's some of them. Sometimes he defended himself. When they handed to him, for instance, they had a Roman coin, and they gave it to Jesus, and they said, whose picture and title are stamped on it? And that's what Jesus asks them, because they're wondering whether they ought to pay taxes to Caesar. And he asked this, whose picture's on there? They said, well, it's Caesar's. Then he said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Now, that doesn't sound like a question, does it? But it prompts the question in their mind of, what belongs to who. That's where you want to be. Jesus walked by a pool where a man had been there for 38 years, and the people who used to carry him down, he was lame, to put him in the pool, hoping he'd be miraculously healed, and they'd stopped coming. Jesus walks by, and oddly enough, he asks a question that sounds a little bit cruel, but he said, "Do you want to be healed?" And that's the key question, because what his response is going to be depends on how he answers that question in himself. And Jesus goes ahead and heals him. Jesus is walking along with his disciples, and he's wanting to narrow down their understanding of who he is as they get to this point in his ministry. And he says, "Who do the people say the Son of Man is?" And they give several different answers that they've been hearing people say. And finally, he narrows it down. He said, "But who do you say that I am?" And that's the key question for anybody in this room. Anybody who's a worshiper of Jesus has to deal with that question. Who do you say that Jesus is? Sometimes we see that there's a disconnect in a conversation. This can happen at a board meeting. It can happen at work. Clearly happens a lot of times in relationships in your home. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I command? There's a disconnect. And at some point, you have to just answer for that. After the resurrection, Jesus takes a walk with Peter, who had denied him how many times? 3 times. Takes Peter for a walk, and I'm sure he thought, Jesus is taking me to the woodshed. And he said, "Do you love me?" "Well, you know I love you." "Do you love me?" "You know I love you." And that question helps heal the relationship that has been broken because of Peter's denial. But it also clarifies what is the relationship going to be between Peter and Jesus. And then Jesus asks on another occasion, "Can any of you, by worrying, add a single moment to your lifespan?" How many of you struggle with that? Anybody here worry? Anybody struggle about what tomorrow is going to be? Whether there's going to be enough? Whether you're going to have enough time? All those kinds of things. That is a question that cuts through a lot of stuff. Somebody came up to Jesus and said, "Would you please, as a traveling rabbi, would you please bid my brother divide the inheritance with me?" And Jesus' response to him is, "Friend, who appointed me as your judge and arbiter?" And interestingly enough, I'm not sure where we're going with that. Interestingly enough, even in that early story about the woman brought in adultery, when Jesus says, "Let he among you who is without sin cast the first stone," it's not a question, is it? But what does it prompt? In the people, they're saying, "Do I have the right?" And that's the whole point. He doesn't have to tell anybody. He doesn't have to lecture anybody. He just says, if you have no sin, cast the first stone. And then they have to ask themselves the question. My life was turned around by a question. Changed the entire trajectory of my life. Now, before that question came, you need to know, I was in youth group as a kid. I was there every Sunday night. And every year, they would have what they called Youth Sunday. And Youth Sunday was when youth would take every part of the worship service and lead it. It was really kind of cool. It gave you a feel for what it was like to lead that part of the service. And they'd pick usually 3 of the youth to give 5-minute messages to fill in that sermon time. Several times I got picked to be one of those 3 youth. And I would always check with my parents to see if what I was going to say was going to embarrass the family. And I would do that 5-minute sermon. Invariably, I would go out at the end of those services, and the adults would reach down, they'd ruffle the hair on my head, which I hated, and they'd say, "You're going to grow up and be a minister." And my thought was, not a chance in the world. That's the most boring occupation I can think of. Fast forward to junior year in college. I'm a psychology major, and I decided for some reason to write a term paper on the comparison between pastoral counseling and psychotherapy. I thought, I wonder what the difference is between those. So I went and I talked to my home pastor. And we talked about that, and he answered what he thought, because he did some pastoral counseling, and I was going to compare that with some therapists that I had a chance to talk to. And then out of the blue, asked the question, "You ever thought about being a minister?" He didn't say you should, or you ought to. He said, "Have you ever thought about it?" And I said, "Yeah, I thought about it." But then he asked the key question, "Would you like to know what the life is like?" And that intrigued me. Sure. Well, and he started to say, well, there's no 2 days alike. You get to preach, you get to teach, you get to counsel, you get to administrate and organize, you get to mobilize a church, you get to be a part of people's most intimate times of their life, even if you don't know them very well, marriage, burials, things like that. And he kept talking about all the things, all the pieces that are part of it. And I thought, that feels like me. And that's why I went into ministry, was because of that. That one question, well, the two questions together turned my life. And that's what questions can do. It's interesting, a couple of the sermons that have happened recently on other awareness and empathy, both of the preachers finished with a set of questions that are helpful to show empathy and that you're aware of what the other is. I'm going to give you another set of questions. What possibilities do you see here? What happens if you don't do anything? How did you get there? Can you explain your thinking? What do you think the consequences of that decision would be if you go that direction? What do you believe caused this? What led us up to this spot? And the other one, which is like Jesus, avoiding triangulation. Why are you putting me in the middle of this? Have you ever had that? Because people do that. They love to do that. There is, how many of you are familiar with the prayer of St. Francis, right? It's the one, grant me the, how does it start? Well, this is the second half. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace, right? I just went blank there for a minute. But the part that challenges me the most is the second half of the prayer, and that's this. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled, but to console, to be understood as to understand. That's the phrase. Because most of us want to be understood. When we get into conversations, especially if it's somebody who has a different view of us, we just want them to understand our viewpoint. And St. Francis had it right. We start with trying to understand them. And how do you do that? You ask a question. And here's the rub. Most of us are at some point of period in our life where we're kind of secure in what we think and what we know and how we act and what we believe. And we don't really want that disrupted very much. But if we knew that asking a question in a conversation could deepen a relationship, could take it deeper and make it stronger, would you be willing to do that more? Oh, in the words of Britney Spears, oops, I did it again. I just asked you another question. But the question is, would you? pray with me. Lord, thank you that we have the model of Jesus to follow so that we don't just bump around in life. Thank you that we have his way of dealing with people and understanding people and caring for people so that we can have relationships that are better than a 4 or 5. Remind us when we get in the heat of discussions to just simply try to understand more and ask the question so that we don't just keep fighting. Grant to us that we can be instruments of your peace. And do that in Jesus' name. Amen.